All right, it's great to see everybody. I think I probably know absolutely everyone in the room. So we're going to talk about, this was a moving target as we prepared this because the path to uniformity is even changed in the last week. So I'm going to just start with a super brief overview. I don't have a timer I'll go over. A super brief overview of the history of drug abuse in horse racing. It starts that we know of. This is history, right? That's when we started writing it down. In 1750, the leaves of the cocoa plant were brought to England from Peru for use in racehorses. So that's cocaine and caffeine. The next thing I could find was some articles talking about a speed-sustaining elixir, again brought from America. Now this time brought from America to America from Europe. So it doesn't just go one way. That's in 1895. I'll just do a really quick rundown. In the 30s, everything illegal that you can imagine for yourself or for humans was used in horses. Nitroglycerin, heroin, cocaine, strychnine, ephedrine. In the 40s and 50s, we moved on to amphetamines. In the 60s, wow, that's when you started using Butin Lasix. Of course, about 20 years later, Lasix was legal in almost every jurisdiction, highly regulated, but legal. In the 70s, Tolwyn and fentanyl. I think fentanyl might have been part of the reason why Dr. Tobin his position was funded at the University of Kentucky by the HBPA in order to come up with drug testing methods for some of these drugs. And then in the 80s, it was etorphine, also known as elephant juice. In the 90s, erythropoietin started being used. And I'm going to point out that a lot of these things were legal until they weren't. So, for example, I know of a lot of actual stand-up ethical veterinarians that used erythropoietin in the early 90s because it was reported to really make horses feel better and do better. And so they used it, and then they were told they can't, and so they stopped. Not to say that that stopped it forever for everyone, but it did stop its legal use. And then in the 2000s, cobra venom, and then there was a fairly large scandal about dermorphine. And now we're starting to, I say, swing back around to things that seem really illegal. Drug testing, the very first thing that I found on the history of drug testing is a fellow named John Keane. He owned a farm in Kentucky that eventually became Keeneland. He went to Russia and was racing horses, and he was suspected of wrongdoing, and what they did was they took the saliva from the horses, so that's where a spit box comes from, and administered it to frogs, and the frogs acted very strangely, and they decided that that was evidence of doping. And it probably was. One of the advantages, or one of the purposes of saliva is, of course, if drugs are administered orally fairly recently, then obviously drugs will be present in high concentration in the saliva. Shortly after that, in France, they began testing using analytical chemistry methods. The first U.S. labs were set up in Florida and then New York, and we're pretty sure that Malin in 1935 took the helm because he's really old. And then he's still there. I'm kidding about him starting it, but it can't have been too much later than that, because he has been there a long, long time. In 1947, the Association of Official Racing Chemists was formed, of which there are several members in the room today. In the 80s, thin layer chromatography was used to screen samples. In the late 80s was the introduction of ELISA testing, thanks to, again, our colleague, Dr. Tobin. And in the 2000s, instrumental mass spec, first GC mass spec and then LC mass spec, became standard. And if I went on and on I could spend the entire hour and a half talking about LCMS, because it absolutely revolutionized drug testing. So with all of that drug testing, cat and mouse, has anything changed? so maybe not. You know, maybe there's still just rampant cheating. There's widespread drug abuse, cat and mouse game of ever-increasing sensitivity to drug testing and new drugs. Is there anything we can do? Hang on a minute. Drug abuse in human sports, current, 2021, 0.77% positive test, of which almost half were for illegal anabolic steroids. Most of the rest are things like beta-2 agonists, other anabolic agents. A tiny amount are for inadvertent environmental contamination. So the latest thing I could find, I asked Ed, but he didn't get back to me. In 2020, so I don't know, did I put down the total number in humans? Okay, there we go, 240. So out of about a similar number of tests, we had about half, a little bit more than half of the percentage were declared post-race positives. Of them, only 28%. So we have a lower percentage of actual potentially doping. The remainder is environmental contamination, inadvertent overages. Even of the 28% for class 1 substances, most of them could reasonably be considered environmental in origin. The methamphetamines, morphines, things like that are inadvertent transfer from either urine in humans. So in human sports, theirs is actually down because it was considerably higher than that in 2013. In horse racing, we're up a little bit. A year or two ago, it was even higher, actually. But shortly after the implementation of the controlled therapeutic medication schedule, we had about double that 0.34. It's about 0.67%. And that's gone down. And I'm going to be honest with you, that's because people have quit using therapeutic medications. There's a lot of therapeutic medications, like methylcarbamol, that are very useful, not very effective at doing anything, but they're useful for day-to-day use. People have quit using a lot of therapeutics because of the incredibly restrictive drug testing. So, has the increase in drug testing, stringent regulations, impressive suspensions and fines, have those actually changed much? Not really, and if anything, it's gone up. So obviously that means we need HISA because we're not able to fix this on our own, right? No, I don't think so. What HISA does, and the regulations that they've written and proposed and have not yet been adopted, they double down on the calling of environmental contamination as well as insignificant trace levels. I'm going to try to go through this kind of quick to not take up too much time, but there are the oversight prior to HISA is there's a few sort of broad things that the federal government has put in place, just the basic rules that determine how veterinarians practice and how pharmacists practice. And then state government have veterinary practice acts and state boards of pharmacy. Both the state boards of pharmacy and the veterinary boards have similar organizations to the ARCI, meaning they have nationwide organizations that include regulators from every state, and every state, they get together once a year and chat about how regulations should change. They make model rules, and the model rules are then adopted for the most part with minor changes in each jurisdiction. That would be the identical scheme to ARCI and the state racing commissions. The state racing commissions have slightly different state administrative law, and then the stewards and judges enforce that. Don't know where to put house rules, because in some states house rules are more important than others. In some states the actual racetracks can't make too many rules. So our RCI is comprised of commissioners, and the state commissions either adopt by reference or adopt piecemeal the ARCI model rules. The RMCC is a private group that advises the ARCI, and they also advise individual state racing commissions. this is the most important thing to me, and that is that there is opportunity for input from anyone who wants to provide input at a number of levels in this scheme. So if I go to ARCI, I can go to ARCI, I can comment to my State Practice Act, boards of pharmacy, I can go to before the Racing Commission, so I have multiple opportunities to explain why I think their rules are messed up, or rarely be in favor of them. So the rule of RCI, this comes right off their website. You all know who you are, so I'm not going to go on. So this is replaced by HISA. So HISA just completely circumvents anything state government, Veterinary Practice Act, state boards of pharmacy, all set aside. Racing commissions set aside. They have their own stewards and judges. RCI has no, which is disappointing because RCI has been in existence since, what did I say, 1934? What was the year I said? Anyway, they've been doing this a really long time, and HISA just started and they didn't ask. And that's just disappointing. The RMTC still has direct input into HISA. And I don't know where House rules. And of course, the most disappointing thing is there's literally no opportunity, there's no open meetings. They allow you to comment, but you don't even, on their website, as well as comment to the FTC. However, you don't even know if your comments were heard. You get is like a standard taken under advisement, but you don't get to attend open meetings and discuss. The actual mandate, so here's what the Act says, for what it's worth. This is the mandate, and in state law, we would call it the enabling statute if it was state law. In the case of the federal government, it's the enabling act. It says, horses must race free from the influence, emphasis on influence, the emphasis is mine, of medications, other foreign substances, and methods that affect their performance, and free from the use of medications and other foreign substances and methods that mask or deaden pain, meaning permitting an injured animal to race. So they failed, so we're going to start with that. I don't know if there's any HISA representatives here, but so y'all have kind of overstepped your mandate. Your mandate says that you should regulate substances that influence performance, and what the regulations that have been either enforced, or put in place, or promulgated are way below and way beyond the point at which they can influence performance. So the Act sounds good, the mandate sounds great, but that is not what they've actually done. And medications and other foreign substances and methods are also regulated. And an example is lidocaine. The existing actual ARCI regulations regulate lidocaine at a completely different level than anything that would actually influence or mask or deaden pain. Doesn't change the penalty, by the way. So let's see if we can look inside their box. I could go on for hours and hours about this, but I just picked one particular aspect. They have what's called a minimum required performance level for the laboratories. So what this means is, if you run a laboratory, that you have to be able to detect the substances on their list at a certain level or below. And they tell you which matrix. They tell you urine or blood. So the previous slide was the exact definition out of the HISA regs, but this is the actual interpretation of that. It's the level at which a laboratory must be able to detect a substance on a day-to-day basis. However, a laboratory can call a positive at any level below the MRPL. Why is this important? So the other reason that HISA was put into existence was the requirement or the necessity for uniform regulations across the country. This one thing, the MRPL levels, leads to the establishment of effectively different regulations depending on the laboratory doing the testing. The point being is that they have to detect to one level, but they can call a positive at any level below that. For substances that reflect actual cheating, this is a great system because if one lab can find it really, really low, they can share their methods with other laboratories and they can all find it better. So that's yay. Go HISA. That's what we want. We want to be able to detect substances like erythropoietin, somatotropin, designer anabolics. But for therapeutic medications, this represents a huge difference in regulations state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on the laboratory doing the testing. For example, aminocaproic acid can be detected by some laboratories for up to 7 days after any effect is gone. What did we say? Substances that may influence performance. The effect of aminocaproic acid is about 12 hours, but they can find it for 7 days. So they've way overstepped the boundaries of their enabling act in this issue. We have the same problems with a number of other substances that I've listed. I'm going to go on. I wrote an article about this in the Horseman's Journal, so if you're not getting enough here, you can just read your article, the next edition. So the end result is that the differing capabilities of different laboratories calling things at or below the MRPLs will cause some positives in some jurisdictions and not others. And so let's just go through, we'll just do a quick review. Not one existing or proposed HISA regulation could have stopped the federal indictments. SGF 1000, the supposed vast doping conspiracy, not one existing or proposed HISA regulation could have stopped that. So the screening limits, everybody knows Schick-McGahee's a cheater, right? 15 days for an ace-promazine positive. HISA screening limits are not based on science, making some therapeutic medication violations essentially impossible to avoid. Methylcarbamol, we already talked about. Mandela, another huge cheater. Please don't quote me on that. Please tell them I was kidding.
Got him on speed dial.
I'll never go in Shig's barn again. So this results, this MRPL, gabapentin is another brilliant one, it permits calling positives at any level, at any whatsoever level below some arbitrary level, results in a huge, so anyway, I'm going to quit on that. That's almost my last slide, but you can see that the report card that I am giving HISA for their proposed regulations. I think I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Barker, and my point, the point that he's bringing up is bufotenine, which is another good example of this problem that we have with the MRPLs.
Could we have the frogs, please? Thank you. Well, it's good to be back. Just a brief report from the retirement zone. Give it a try first chance you get. It's really awesome. So I was contacted by Clara about mainly the recent rash of positives that was called in Mid-Atlantic state, whose first name starts with a P, for bufotenate. And one of the reasons she contacted me is little known to most everyone, is that for the last 46 years, I have been studying hallucinogen pharmacology. Now, some of the people who know me very well say, oh, yeah, that explains a lot. Yeah. And doing the horse racing drug testing basically helped fund my research into what's commonly known now as endogenous hallucinogens. Turns out, we started this work back in '76, humans, rats, and a variety of other animal species all carry within their brains 3 known hallucinogens. bufotenin, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, and 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. Right? And that's the work I've been doing. I've published over 50 articles in that area. But bufotenin was one of the compounds that I've studied a great deal. So, of course, now that I'm retired emeritus professor, but mainly the yard man, the chef, cook, bottle washer, go out metal detecting from time to time. I don't play pickleball. And, and people have called me a world-renowned expert in hallucinogen pharmacology. I'm far too modest to say that myself, but I had no problem putting it on a slide. Okay, so next. So bufotenin was named after the bufo species of frog. That name has since changed because of the ongoing changes in naming of animals. It's a tryptamine compound. This is the structure down here in the corner. It's very similar to the neurotransmitter serotonin. So it actually acts at the same receptors in the brain, in the gut, in the periphery, that serotonin does. Right? So Incilius alvarius, this good-looking dude here, secretes bufotoxins in its skin. Right? And these secretions have been discovered over millennia to be hallucinogenic, to the point where the National Park Service had to put up signs that says, please do not suck the toads, particularly the Colorado River toad, right, where people would go around doing little toad sucking. I heard about that when I was growing up, and I was like, really? Actually, it is not as active if you just take a toad and start licking it, right? If you scrape the secretions off the skin, dry them, put them in a pipe and smoke them. Don't ask me how I know that. But what we have the greatest concern for horse racing is the fact that very high concentrations of 5-methoxy-DMT, a hallucinogen that is 1/10 as potent as LSD, and bufotenin occur in reed canary grass in different species of Phalaris, Phalaris aquatica and Phalaris arundinacea. Forgot my Latin. So what you find in the Phalaris species are these compounds. N,N-dimethyltryptamine, a naturally occurring hallucinogen in man. Right? 5-methoxy-DMT, naturally occurring hallucinogen in man. Bufotenin, naturally occurring hallucinogen in man. Boy, I was wondering we're not all just kind of, Beta-carbolines, which are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They inhibit the ability of the organ to destroy these three compounds, along with gramine and hordenine, which really don't do much, just add a little color. If you administer 5-methoxy-DMT to mice, in this case, because we have no information on administration of bufotenin or 5-methoxy-DMT to horses, you wouldn't want to be around a horse while it's on 5-methoxy-DMT. You do get bufotenin from it. So 5-methoxy-DMT is converted to bufotenin, and that's mainly where it comes from. Right? It's not so much that bufotenin is being produced by the plant for any other purpose. 5-methoxy-DMT does the trick for these plants and for the frogs. A very potent hallucinogen. It's used as a defense mechanism. Right? Of course, it turned out not to work very well for humans. They were tracking down the frogs and licking them. So, I mean, but that's where it comes from. 5-methoxy-DMT reaches a fairly high concentration of 298 nanograms per mil, but bufotenin only 10.6 for an administration of 2 milligrams per kilogram in mice. So it is very rapidly absorbed and very rapidly cleared. Right? Clearance rates, minimum residence time, 17.6 minutes and 24.3 minutes. So eating grass, that contains the leaves or the stems, stalks of Phalaris species, delivers these compounds to the horse's digestive system. And if you look at the concentrations of 5-methoxy-DMT in phalaris grasses over time during the year, it varies with season and varies with how much is in the leaves and how much is in the stalk. But these are very high concentrations. I mean, over the years, I've seen not a lot of people who would go out and collect this and extract it and, have a party. But this is what happens with a horse. A horse eats a fairly large amount of hay, and it takes 3 days for that to transit from the gut all the way to feces. Right? Well, during that 3 days, these compounds are continuing to be absorbed throughout the digestive tract. So an exposure to phalaris grass or some of these can cause the presence of 5-methoxy-DMT, 5-hydroxy-DMT, which is bufotenin, in the horse's system. Right? Now, the absorption from the digestive tract takes it into the blood, and the blood delivers it around to all the organs, and it ends up in the urine or the feces. If it stays in the digestive tract, it ends up in the feces. But it's absorbed through the blood, into the blood, shows up in the urine. All right, takes 3 days to get there. So one exposure, can last quite some time, and it takes a fairly small amount. Right? So if we look at the scientific studies that have studied the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and clearance of phalaris alkaloids, that should help us understand what's going on with this. Unfortunately, there's not any. Nobody's done it. We're regulating it, but nobody's actually done the administration and study of it in a horse. So we might as well watch grass grow. Isn't that nice? Okay, so the other thing, and this is something that I don't quite understand. Well, I do, but I can't explain it. Well, I could, but it'd take too long. So I'll start. Is that tryptophan is the source of serotonin, right? Of the neurotransmitter serotonin in our brains. We get that from our diets. All animals consume some kind of protein that contains tryptophan. Tryptophan is one of the amino acids that makes up proteins, right? That's converted to 5-hydroxytryptophan and then to serotonin and then to our favorite, melatonin. It helps you sleep, right? It's a good thing. But the other pathways that we have discovered and published on for 46 years is that dimethyltryptamine through a methylation pathway and formation of tryptamine also forms bufotenin, dimethyltryptamine, and 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. So we know that this is endogenous in humans. Right? We know that it's endogenous in rats. We know it's endogenous in mice. We know it's in frogs. We know and it's in a lot of plants. It's a fairly common compound. Of course, the levels that you normally find in brain, in humans and in other animals, is not sufficient to actually produce profound hallucinations, which taking these compounds directly really does. And again, don't ask me how I know. I wouldn't be a good scientist if I didn't understand my subject. So, these compounds are there in these species, but no one's really looked to see whether or not they naturally occur in horses. This was a large study that we did looking at all the, it turned out to be 69 different studies that had measured endogenous hallucinogens, right? Since we started doing this they started doing this in the 50s, right? And in humans, it was there. I mean, it was just there. They couldn't refute that. They found all 3 of these compounds. And this was a study that I did along with Ethan McElhenney. Yes, he's that McElhenney. That's the great-great-grandson of the person who did Tabasco. And Dr. Rick Strassman, who has started back doing hallucinogen research in the U.S. in 1993. Right? So we were fortunate in the fact that a very recent, fairly recent cluster of bufotenins were called in a Midwest state whose first name starts with a P. And the concentrations they found were extremely small. They were in the picogram range. Now, if you have a small paper clip that weighs a gram, take a thousandth of that, it's a milligram. Take a thousandth of that, it's a microgram. Take a thousandth of that, right, and you're down to nanograms. Take a thousandth of a nanogram, and you're down to picograms. That's how 10 to the minus 12. That's how small amounts we're talking about, and they were finding in the picogram range. Fortunately, in December, the ARCI came out with a recommendation basically adopting what's in the IFHA rules, that there should be a urine threshold for bufotenin. And this has been around for a very long time. I mean, this isn't really something new. It's just new to the U.S. Of 10 million picograms, it's 10 micrograms, right, in the urine is the threshold for it. They didn't give one in blood. Well, ARCI issued a kind of revision of the rules that there is a penalty recommendation for urine, but no threshold has been adopted and found in blood. Further investigation is necessary. Yeah, you think? What went the wrong way? So the further investigation that is needed is, one, is bufotenin just a naturally occurring substance in equine blood and urine? I'd bet money on it. I'd bet more than money on it, but my wife won't let me. What's the effect of hemolysis on the measurement of blood levels? One of the reasons you may find some of these hallucinogens in blood and you may not may depend on how many red cells have ruptured. And we all know from the collection of blood samples in horses after a race, sometimes the way the samples are handled, it leads to breakage of the red cells. Some of these drugs are carried on the surface membrane and inside red cells. So if you spin those down and you only look at plasma or serum, you might not find it. So were some of the positives that were called only because the cells were partially ruptured in those samples? Possibility. It needs to be looked at. There are currently no published studies that examine bufotenin administrations in horses or administration of phalaris grasses so that you can determine what the levels should be. So what we need to know is, a threshold or limit of detection that should be used to account for endogenous concentrations, and data that will tell us about a threshold that should be set from a source of bufotenin that was other than not nefarious. Right? The reason there's a need for this, there's more, is this mid-Atlantic state whose first name starts with a P, again, found very low levels, 56.6 picograms per mil in blood, extremely low. And they had some samples where they measured horses' urine, the blood and the urine. And the bufotenin level was 1,964, 731, 1,407. Well, given that the threshold in urine is 10 million, why would you call positives on this? Right? Because it's in the blood, and there was no threshold in the blood. So if we find it in the blood, it must be cheating, even though the urine level is exceedingly low. I could not follow that logic, and none of us should. Right? So I'm introducing so that we understand how little amount this is, what I've called the Barker relativistic flea factor, or the BRF. The BRF is based on the fact that a female flea at birth, before it has a blood meal, weighs 450 micrograms. So if you have 0.56 picograms per mil of bufotenin in a sample, the total amount in a horse is 50,000 mils of blood, roughly, would be 2.8 micrograms. Well, 2.8 micrograms would be 0.62% of a female flea, right? So you imagine a 500 kilogram animal that has 0.62% of a female flea distributed throughout its entire body. What do you think the drug effect would be? Zero, nothing, right? And this is the case in a lot of the positives that are being called now that Clara referred to. Extremely small amounts in the picogram range that if you measure the amount in the entire animal, which I think Dr. Scalay was very, very good about bringing up. Well, but it's that much per mil, but the horse has 50,000 mils, so think of all that in the horse. Yeah, but it's distributed throughout the horse. It's not even that necessarily at the organ where that particular drug acts. Right? It's even less if you consider that. Right? So I've been using the BERF lately. Right? And part of the reason I think these things were called is a paper that was published in 2006 by the French lab. Yves Bonner, who's done a lot of very good work, got it completely wrong. Right? When bufotenin is detected in urine, an injection of bufotenin or DMT should be suspected. No. First of all, DMT is never converted to bufotenin. Right? Dimethyltryptamine, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, is never converted to bufotenin. And this completely ignored the fact that there was a food source for bufotenin, that horses would come in contact with it, and that's where it would come from. Right? So another statement that I'd heard is, since there's no threshold in blood, any amount found there must be from cheating, must be an injection. Right? Nope. That's in spite of the fact that the urine threshold was 10 micrograms, so that's all horse pucky. Drugs don't appear in the urine unless they have passed through the blood. They just don't. You don't get a drug showing up in a urine sample that can be drug tested unless it passed through the blood. So having no threshold in blood led to these issues. But these issues were more than that. I considered them abuses of power by the drug testing laboratory to have reported those and issued a C of A to the commission, who then acted on it. Fortunately, Mr. Ness has had his positive rescinded. A little bit of common sense has finally come to the market. But we need that for a lot of other compounds as well. Right? So, if HISA is going to do its job, these kinds of positives have to be given scientific consideration. Not, oh, we found it, we confirmed it, you're guilty. I've seen that way too much. But are they going to worry about the integrity of the industry, just giving the industry a black eye for all these positives? When really the more important thing is the integrity and reputation of trainers, owners, and the horses affected. What if this had been a horse that won a Kentucky Derby? Right? Gone through all that again. Right? So using science, coming up with reasonable levels to call positives on that really do meet their mandate is what HISA should be doing. I don't know that they will. I certainly hope they will. So thank you very much, and laissez les bon sang rouler. You'll have a good time.
Pardon? What?
Make sure and leave time for Daniel.
Okay. How much time do we have? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Thomas Tobin, and on my better days, I am a professor in the Maxwell H. Gluck Equine Research Center at the University of Kentucky. Now, let me see if I figured this right. What do I do? Just press the center? Forward. I'm going to speak about human use substances transferring to horses, irrelevant plasma concentrations, and I'm going to speak about two specific substances, gabapentin and fentanyl. And I want to specifically recognize Maria Catangani and Todd Mosteller, who have assisted me with some of the regulatory aspects of this presentation. I'm going to, case number one is a classic. I'm addressing basically the concept of inadvertent transfer of prescription medications from a human to a horse. And case number 1 is 4 medications transferring in Ohio. Case number 2 is gabapentin transferring from a dog to a horse. That was validated by the English Drug Testing Lab. And then I'm going to speak about fentanyl. I was approached by some regulatory groups and asked what would be a cutoff for fentanyl that would be consistent with inadvertent transfer. And I'm going to give you my best interpretations of that. Case number 1, gabapentin and 3 other substances transferring from a human. This came out of Ohio. There were a large number of gabapentin identifications in Ohio. Let me tell you very briefly about gabapentin. The dose to a human can be as high as 3 grams per day, and that's a lot of molecules going in the front end of a human. Very unusually, the human does not metabolize it, so when you go to the bathroom, 3 grams of gabapentin pass out into wherever your urine is going, and if it's a horse stall, you've got 3 grams in a horse stall, which is a lot. It's absorbed orally, so it readily contaminates the environment and transfers from humans by a variety of routes. Sometimes you can figure it out, sometimes you can't, to horses. Reviewing some of the data that came up on a Freedom of Information request in Ohio, we had the highest blood concentration. Just a second, sorry, I flipped the wrong button there. The highest blood concentration in a horse was 9.4 nanograms per ml. Now, the Ohio cutoff is 8 nanograms, so this one was 10-fold higher than the cutoff. It's still no pharmacology in the horse, but it's relatively high, and the groom was prescribed gabapentin and he was urinating in the stall. This groom was also on 3 other medications: hydrochlorothiazide, discovered in the horse; odesmethyltramadol, which is the metabolite of tramadol, identified in the horse; and nordiazepam, a tranquilizer, a benzodiazepine tranquilizer, also identified in the horse. So here we had an individual who was on 4 prescription medications, and they all showed up in a horse that he was associated with. This is the largest number, to my knowledge, of human prescription medications transferring to a horse reported to date. The next one is particularly interesting, and it's got a little personal flavor. I'm going to mention the name. There's a veterinarian in Ireland working with Coolmore Stud, and his name is Dr. John Halley, and he has a Rhodesian Ridgeback dog, and his wife took it to the veterinarian, and the veterinarian prescribed gabapentin for the dog. Now, the dog wouldn't have been getting 3 grams, but he might have been getting 300 milligrams, a tenth of the dose. And the dog had the run of the farm, and apparently the vet suggested that the dog had access to the horse stalls. A racehorse turns up positive post-race for gabapentin in Ireland. By the way, the testing is done for Ireland is now done in the English lab. So the vet quietly suggested a canine origin for equine gabapentin, and published in the Irish Times, you have a report that the English laboratory, LGC, performed an extensive laboratory investigation and apparently included dosing dogs, found sufficient scientific evidence for the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board to accept the presented explanation for the post-Ross positive as likely. So it's now official in the published domain that you can dose a horse with a dog with gabapentin, and it can turn up in a racehorse. As I said, it's now official that gabapentin can transfer from a dog to horses. No fewer than human prescription medications can transfer together from a human to a racing horse. And one last thing I'd like to mention, we have a recent identification in a certain state in the East whose name begins with P for gabapentin. It's the lowest concentration of gabapentin identified in a plasma. It's 190 picograms per ml. And what's unusual about this case is that the horse was out of competition tested The day before it raced, a sample was taken, the horse was clean, and then when it raced a day later, it had a trace level of gabapentin in the horse. And this is looks like another classic case of transfer, environmental transfer to a horse. I'm now going to review the matter of trace level amounts of fentanyl showing up in post-race plasma, and I'm going to suggest, and I'm working on a plasma cutoff for fentanyl. Fentanyl has been showing up in post-race plasma samples at quite low concentrations, and the suggestion has been raised that this is due to trace level transfer from recreational fentanyl users. And I was asked by various people in the industry to identify a screening limit, or effectively a threshold below which there's no likelihood of a pharmacological effect. And I'm going to propose and hopefully publish a 50 picogram per ml relevant plasma concentration as a plasma screening limit. A word or two about fentanyl. It's a relatively simple, straightforward molecule. It's highly lipid soluble, which means when you inject fentanyl, you inject it intravenously. It goes as a bolus to the central nervous system and produces the pharmacological effects there immediately. If you look at the fentanyl positives that have occurred over the years, and this is courtesy of Racing Commission, ARCI, we see that the test first became available, that's 1978, so we had a blip of about 30 positives, and then they went away. And then we have sporadic identifications, about 1, 2, 3 a year, and then we have a long period with no identifications, and suddenly in 2018, we have a little spurt of identifications with a dozen or so identifications. So the question is, are these concentrations, what's the significance of these concentrations? And when we looked at the concentrations, we found that they were in picograms per ml. Here, these are less than 40, less than 30, less than 20, less than 10, and there are two in here in this group that are actually less than a picogram, they're femtograms per ml. So these are relatively extremely low concentrations of fentanyl, and the question I've been asked to come up with is this a pharmacologically significant concentration? Many chemists, regulators, horse persons concerned about trace level fentanyl plasma identifications. 11 samples less than 40 picograms per ml, 2 samples below 1 picogram per ml, a request for guidance. And what we did was we took the Tutane standard for an irrelevant plasma concentration. Now, this is an established mathematical process in the literature. You take the effective plasma concentration and you divide it by 500, and that concentration is regarded as an irrelevant plasma concentration. And I will say it's an extremely conservative value, so it would be difficult to dispute such a value. So what is the effective concentration of fentanyl for a pharmacological effect? I described how when you inject fentanyl into a horse, it goes directly to the brain, and what the horse starts doing is it starts to trot. And it's a simple matter of counting the footsteps, and we started doing this in the late 1970s, and we got some classic pharmacological data. Here we have I think this is about this is about a 2 milligram, this is a half a milligram, 2 milligrams, 4 milligrams, 8 milligrams, and this is 16 milligrams of fentanyl given rapid IV, and you can see the increase in locomotor activity. It peaks within minutes because the drug hits the brain after the IV injection, and then it redistributes to the horse, and you lose the pharmacological effect. And that was one of the more interesting experimental identifications I have had in my career. We saw this, and it's very reproducible in the horse. Review of the locomotor data that we did in the late 70s showed that the response peaked at about 50 nanograms per ml of fentanyl, and below 5 nanograms there was no locomotor response. There's a German study published showing that greater than 6 nanograms per ml of fentanyl is required for an analgesic effect. And so we picked halfway between these two concentrations as the effective plasma concentration is 25 nanograms per ml. Divide by 500, you've got 50 picograms per ml. And that comes up as an irrelevant, he didn't say ineffective, he says an irrelevant plasma concentration, which is a careful choice of words, and it's a wise choice. Here is an interesting case. Worked with this with Maria Canagani on this, fentanyl and euthanol identifications. Two 2020 winning Charlestown horses showed post-race identifications of fentanyl and euthanol. Euthanol is an illicit recreational substance chemically related to cathinone. These are called bath salts on the streets and apparently being used recreational and with fentanyl. So we had a trace identification of two recreational substances, which was good evidence that suggestive that it was an inadvertent transfer from a user. And the rulings noted that an employee of one trainer who had access to both horses had refused to take a fentanyl test, which led to his suspension. And the standard penalty of Class A was not imposed, and no multiple medication violation points, recognizing the substantial evidence of lack of trainer culpability with regard to this trace level identification of substances of human use and addiction. We have two other cases of interest with regards to fentanyl. In Pennsylvania rules of racing, there are words specifically written into the Pennsylvania rules. Substances of human use and addiction may be found in the horse juice due to its close association with humans. And if substantial evidence is presented to the Bureau of Directors during a hearing which indicates the positive test may have been a result of environmental contamination, these factors may be considered in mitigation of any disciplinary action against the affected trainers. There's been one report of a 0.3 nanograms, these are femtograms of plasma detection of fentanyl, and the stewards decided that due to mitigating circumstances, no further action on this positive. And in another case, a 0.76 nanograms, the trainer was found not responsible for the medication violation, and no penalties were assessed against his license. Doing the searching the internet on this matter, we noted that the SAMHSA, that the human authorities have a cutoff of 1 nanogram per milliliter in urine for fentanyl. It's not clear. I think this is a limit of detection, an effective limit of detection in their screening process, and they don't pursue them below that concentration. And there was an interesting discussion. During the discussion, a certain Captain Welch explained that although there is not a screening test specifically for fentanyl in the Department of Defense testing, the presumption of a positive test will rely on an individual being positive for fentanyl and another drug, for example, cocaine and fentanyl or an opioid in fentanyl. So the Department of Defense looks when they're looking at fentanyls, they look for evidence of recreational use, which is a trace of another substance present in the sample. So fentanyl summary, fentanyl is a widely available distributed street substance detected at trace amounts in equine plasma samples. We were asked to identify an environmental exposure cutoff, and we're coming up with a 50 picogram per ml cutoff, and I'm going to submit this for publication and try to get it into the refereed scientific literature so it will be out there for the industry to be aware of. The evidence continues to accumulate concerning trace level transfers of human use substances, medications, and now we have an official recognition of a transfer from a dog. For gabapentin, the Ohio State Racing Commission has an in-house screening limit of 8 nanograms per ml, and we're going to publish, I believe, a proposal for 50 picograms for fentanyl as an environmental transfer cutoff. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Dr. Fenger, Dr. Kimberly Bloor, who helps me with the internet research, Dr. Bricado, who's South American and Middle Eastern colleague, a colleague at the University of Kentucky, and Maria Categani, and Mr. Todd Mosteller for their assistance with this matter. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much indeed.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. As Eric stated earlier, my name is Daniel Marquez. I am a attorney from El Paso, Texas. As you see in my biography, my primary history in the legal field was as a Marine judge advocate. I was a major in the Marine Corps, and in that experience, I worked in a variety of positions which inform really my philosophy and my practice, and the perspective in which I look at the current state that we see with respect to the federal regulation within the horse racing industry. And so let me explain that a little bit to you. Is with respect to the foundational principles of our society. Let's go back, as Dr. Fenger did, with just a little bit of a history. And that is that this is a federalist society, governmental structure that we have. And sometimes we lose sight of what that is and what that means because of the modern times that we live in. In a federalist system, there is the recognition that there are dual sovereigns, the individual states and the federal government. And our founding principles are that the federalist system should be very, very, very weak. We should not have a strong federal system, and that the individual states should exercise the power over their individual constituencies. And that is something that I subscribe to. And it is something that at the turn of the century, with the New Deal era and with Roosevelt's New Deal policies, which were reactionary to things that had occurred in the world and in the United States at that time with the Great Depression, the idea that federal oversight was much more necessary to deal with the economic recessions and the lack of any federal regulatory power. And so from the New Deal era, this idea of federal agencies grew. And because they have been with us so long, we tend to think of them as something that we must live with, something that just exists. And that is not necessarily the case. Although, unfortunately, we have some reminders that federal oversight is necessary. Enron, the stock market crash and the recession of 2008, recently with cryptocurrency. We see sometimes that in private industry, when there is no federal oversight, the optics of it tend to make us believe that, well, we need the feds to come in and assist in regulating because the market or individual states can't do it on their own. Again, it's not a philosophy that I subscribe to. However, sometimes that is the optics is what shapes the policy. And so the ends never justify the means. They don't. And this goes back to my comments about my time in the Marine Corps. I acted much like a regulator or in a prosecutorial role, in which we have to hold individuals accountable. We have to promulgate and issue rules and orders that cover huge amounts of people, and the ends never justifies the means. Whatever you're trying to accomplish does not mean that any way to accomplish that however benevolent that goal is not justification for getting to that point. And so with HISA, we've lost track of some of those principles that curb regulators. The bedrock concept of what curbs regulators is the fact that there's transparency, there's accountability, and HISA lacks that. HISA lacks that transparency and accountability. You've heard from Dr. Tobin and from Dr. Barker about some of the data that they were able to acquire because of open records requests. That's accountability, that's transparency. With the addition, the inclusion of private entities into the HISA rulemaking and policy adoption policy, we threaten that accountability, we threaten that transparency. And let me give you a little bit of a case study of what happened in New Mexico a few years to highlight that point as to why transparency and accountability are so important. Especially when we have, under the HISA rubric, as Dr. Fenger pointed out, the definition of minimum required performance levels are the minimal analytical criterion of laboratory technical performance established by the agency, including the minimal concentration at which a laboratory is expected to consistently detect and confirm a prohibited substance, metabolite of a prohibited substance, or marker of a prohibited substance or prohibited method in the routine daily operation of the laboratory. So essentially what that means is that each individual laboratory sets the policy with that MRPL. And the HISA adopts that policy of that private organization. So why is there a concern that there's a lack of accountability or transparency there? Well, back in 2018, in the state of New Mexico, there was a change in the official laboratory for the state of New Mexico, the testing laboratory. The New Mexico Racing Commission had been using UC Davis to conduct all of their testing. And they changed laboratories to industrial labs in Colorado. UC Davis, that's a state-run school and lab. Industrial labs, that's a private laboratory. Now, during the time of that switch, despite the concerns that were expressed by many of the stakeholders, licensees, veterinarians, Dr. Fenger, as to whether or not there would be any change in testing methodologies that might impact medication violations or purported medication violations for corticosteroids such as betamethasone or dexamethasone. Despite those concerns, there was a rash of overages, about 38 corticosteroid overages when that change in labs occurred. And that was because there was different testing methodologies between the individual labs. Now you see the potential problem with an MRPL, which is based off of each individual's lab's independent testing methodologies. Now, in that case, with the corticosteroid overages in New Mexico, through open records requests, which each state had different open records laws. Some are very open and liberal and permissive, and some are very closed off. California has a pretty good open records law. New Mexico has a pretty good open records law. It was only through the ability to gather documentation with respect to the lab's testing methodologies, mostly from UC Davis, that individuals like Dr. Tobin, Dr. Fenger, and a number of other individuals that worked on uncovering what had occurred there, which led to those almost 40 corticosteroid overages, that we were able to see the testing methodologies, to see what was being done, to see how this could have happened. And things that were discovered were things such as pooling of samples at UC Davis and testing in inappropriate matrices, or not the best matrices, for corticosteroids, which then led to a false sense of confidence in practitioners in their medication practices. If you don't have that ability, or that ability is threatened in order to be able to obtain that information, then you don't have transparency and accountability. Because despite the fact that those testing methodologies were uncovered, the New Mexico Racing Commission continued to prosecute these cases. There were several district court opinions that came out in New Mexico that found that because of the change in the testing methodologies and because of the assurances that were provided by the New Mexico Racing Commission that medication practices should stay in line with RMTC withdrawal periods and guidelines, that because those assurances were made and because of the changing in the methodologies from the labs, several New Mexico district court judges recognized very rarely, and not that I've seen in any other jurisdictions, an exception to the absolute insurer rule, or that it was a mitigating circumstances that absolved the licensees of liability or responsibility for those overages. But it had to be pushed. This fight had to be fought in court in order to get to that point, which should have been apparent prior to. That's a very strong take, and those decisions were not appealed. And so those didn't go up to a higher court, to a court of appeals, or to a Supreme Court. Those decisions remained untouched and effective. So why is that important? Without that ability to go and get that information, individuals may have been held liable for something that was not their fault. With HISA and the reliance on individual labs, some of which are private, we lose part of that arm of that accountability. You can't open records or you can't FOIA records from a private lab. They're not subject to those FOIA laws or the state individual open records laws. And so HISA's reliance on those independent labs to create policy has already come under scrutiny. With the Fifth Circuit opinion back in October of 2022, we saw that the HISA structure and how they adopt rules, the anti-doping rules, that was a violation of the private non-delegation doctrine, which in essence states that the federal government cannot delegate to a private entity like a private lab or a private authority like HISA its responsibilities under the law. There are other attacks that are pending on HISA, the anti-commandeering doctrine, which stem from the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which reserve all powers that are not given to the federal government in this federalist structure to the states. They're all reserved to the states. And what that means then is that the federal government cannot hijack a state and then force a state to enforce federal law and to fit the bill for it, which from my understanding is somewhere around $72 million for enforcement of HISA regulations at this point in time. That would have, the burden would have to be carried by individual states. So those challenges are pending as well. I think that Texas has been at the forefront with the Fifth Circuit in challenging HISA, and I imagine that Texas is also going to relook at its attack based off of the January 26th of 2023 proposed notice of rulemaking for the anti-doping rule from HISA, to leverage those other further attacks on it. But it really goes down to basic principles of transparency and accountability. And as you've heard from the panel here, with respect to the basis, the scientific basis for many of these MRPLs or threshold substances, that's information that needs to be known. Because the scariest thing for me is when somebody that's in a position of authority, a regulator, a prosecutor, says, just trust me. I know what I'm doing. Just trust what I'm doing. Okay, I've been there, all right? I've been that person. I don't trust me, okay? There needs to be accountability. The point of discretion is that you can support and justify your judgment. That makes you a good regulator. That makes you somebody that is a good enforcer of the rules, is can you justify what you're doing? And unless you can provide the information for others to look at and critique that and scrutinize that, your justification can never be challenged. And that is something that we should all be very wary of. And so with these challenges now coming with the new HISA proposed rulemaking, I think that those are matters that we need to take into consideration. And with respect to any future challenges, we have to be aware that when we are looking at government regulations and whether or not a proposed rule has been properly promulgated or any type of regulatory action has been properly enacted, there's always the chance for judicial review of that. And judicial review is going to come in a few different forms that is uniform within the federal system, but also within the state systems. Number one, is that regulation constitutional? Number two, was that regulation issued in accordance with the rules? Number two, was that regulation arbitrary and capricious? Or was it an abuse of discretion? And then finally, was that regulation something that was promulgated within the authority of the agency, or what we call ultra vires? And so there are many different ways to attack how these regulations come about, whether it's a lack of notice and public comment. And my understanding is on the new HISA proposed anti-doping rule that there's up to 900 public comments on that. And that's great. That's what Dr. Finger was talking about. But the public comments don't address the underlying problem with that proposed anti-doping rule, which is that HISA is still allowing for private entities to step into the role of the federal government and shape and enact the policy. And that is something that is completely antithetical to transparency and accountability within our representative government, and something that we should be taking a look at. And so within that, the rubric of those different ways in which to challenge regulations, we've got to continue looking at scrutinizing and gathering the information that we can gather in order to ensure that these regulators are following the rules, that they're being the people in the white hat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone on the panel. I wanted to save a few minutes possible for questions, if that's okay with the panelists. So is there anyone in the room that might have a question? Yes, Ms. Petra, Dr. Hartman.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to say I really appreciate hearing kind of the different findings and such. Thank you very much. I wanted to make a couple of points that I felt maybe weren't adequately discussed in the presentation. One of them is that the way the business of laboratory testing has been conducted over the 30-some years that I've been in this industry has been through competitive bid process. So the fact that we have technology now that is able to determine the low levels that we're seeing is precisely what the industry, in a sense, has been asking for. When requests for proposals go out, that's what the labs are asked for. What equipment do you have? How low can you find all of these things? So that drive towards high sensitivity testing has been built into the process for a long time. Being in a private laboratory, we are not in a position to assess the significance of a finding. So in the absence of the jurisdiction that is being tested, if there are no screening limits in place by that jurisdiction, the lab is in the position of having to make that decision, is this something that I call or don't call? If I don't have a rule that I can point to that says you don't have to call below this level, we may very well get asked by an auditor, why didn't you call that? Where does it say that you're allowed to ignore this? And the last thing that I would want to do or have done to me is be listed in the Pollock report as, you know, lab director buries positives, you know, who's paying you off, essentially. So I feel like those are some of the nuances that labs are put in based on the competitive bidding process in the absence of regulations or screening limits that give us any sort of you know, ability to make decisions like that. I also wanted to point out that I think with some of the more potent substances, like Dr. Tobin has talked about with fentanyl, I mean, that's kind of scary when a lab has a finding of fentanyl, and for years, you know, we have heard about the concerns with fentanyl, how potent it is, what it can make a horse do. So again, when you have a finding and you go, gosh, what does this mean? I don't know what it means, but I don't dare ignore it. What do we do in terms of, I think a screening limit would be great for fentanyl, but what do we do for those substances that are excreted so rapidly that a screening limit would not allow us to control race day exposure? I don't want to call it administration, but exposure. Basically, what about the things that are gone so quickly that if we have a screening limit, the horse would be able to be exposed to it and on race day, and you know, the lab would not be reporting it. So those are some of the things that we think about. I'd also like to point out that from the lab perspective, there is no incentive for us to call positives, right? I feel like it's important to say that. We get paid the same amount for a negative sample as we do for a positive sample, but the amount of work that goes into a positive is substantially higher in terms of labor and equipment use. So, you know, by all means, screening limits would be great. If we could reduce our positive count, I'd be happy about that. But the way the process has worked so far has been with competitive bid, how low can you go, what can you find, what can you see? So Maybe HISA is a swing to the other extreme, kind of the pendulum effect. It's swinging from one side to the other. And I can only hope for the sake of the industry that we can find a happy medium where all components of the process, horse, regulator, horseman, labs, you know, that everyone has I guess, a fair balance in the work that we do every day.
Yeah, the problem is not with the laboratory, right? The laboratory does its job. You're supposed to detect things and report them.
Right.
Where the problem lies is with the commissions, or with HISA, when they set up their rules and regulations, is a scientific review of what has been discovered, right? Is the concentration so low, and the literature supports it, that it is of no consequence?
Right.
You know, so the labs can do as low as they want to, right? But the people who make the decisions about going forward with that positive are where it needs to be improved, corrected, taken care of. Instead of doing it, we call the positive, everybody gets embarrassed, the guy's called a cheater, right? It causes a black eye for the industry. And the only review that is had is when it comes before a hearing.
Right.
And then the reporters report, right? Oh, yeah. That's about what I get out of it usually. But, you know, there's where the problem is.
Right.
Science has been, like a lot of our politics, you know, has been put on the back shelf. Right? It's easy to tell whether or not a drug would have an effect on performance. Tom, you know, brought up the Tutane method for calculating irrelevant concentrations in plasma. Such a thing exists. The mere presence of a drug does not mean that there's an effect. Right? But too many commissions, too many other people that have tried to regulate this industry have done more damage to the industry by ignoring science. Right? So the labs are fine. You can sit down.
Thank you.
Petra and I are very good friends, by the way.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, well, unfortunately, we are running over on time, and so I don't have any time for any other questions, but these guys will certainly be here. Want to, once again, thank everyone for the panel, but I also want to make sure that I acknowledge the Ohio HBPA. President Joe Poole is here, several of his board members, the executive director, Dave Basler, who is the chair of both our National HBPA Medication Committee as well as our Model Rules Committee. But if it wasn't for the financial support that Ohio in particular, passionate about this topic, helps us put on such a great venue, and having these guys up here, I wanted to make a special recognition to them for helping us bring this group together. So thank you, and thank you guys.